Jesus crosses a line. Hey everybody, welcome to part 4 of my new devotion series, Just Jesus. As I've said in my other videos, I'm starting this new series to address some of the confusion that people have had over the years about who Jesus is and how he calls his followers to live. And I'm doing this by looking at what he said and then explaining how traditional Christian doctrine has interpreted what he meant by what he said. And I'm starting this by looking at his famous Sermon on the Mount, which starts in Matthew chapter 5 and it ends with Matthew chapter 7. I know Luke also covers it too at the end of Luke 6, but it's an extremely abbreviated version, and so I'm just going to stick with Matthew. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus addresses a large crowd of people, Jewish people, who started following him because of all the miracles that they'd seen him do. And because they were Jewish, they basically believed that God either blessed them or punished them based upon their level of self-righteousness or their ability to keep the law of Moses. Generally speaking, if you were doing well, God must be pleased with you. But if you weren't doing so hot, you probably did something wrong. And so Jesus basically demolishes this whole kind of thinking by telling the crowd that God doesn't work that way. God actually blesses those who admit they have a problem. God blesses the poor in spirit. God blesses the mourners. God blesses those who hunger and thirst for a righteousness that they currently do not possess. So God's blessing isn't manifested in those who think that they've somehow achieved perfect righteousness. Instead, God's blessing is for those who admit that they've fallen far short of it. And then to prove his point, in the last half of Matthew chapter 5, Jesus crosses a pretty big line by setting God's standard of righteousness far beyond the law of Moses, which basically condemns everybody because virtually no one would be able to live up to the standard, the righteous standard that Jesus lays out. He says, "You've heard it said, do not murder. Yeah, I say that anger and bitterness in your heart is just as evil." He says, "You've heard it said, do not commit adultery. Yeah, I say just to look at a woman in lust is just as bad." He says, "You've heard it said that if you want to divorce your wife, just give her a legal certificate. But I tell you," Jesus says, "if you divorce in general, it's considered adultery in God's eye." That's a really hard one. He says, "You've heard it said, do not swear falsely," meaning don't swear to God that you're going to do something. But I say, Jesus says, don't make promises you can't keep because only God truly knows what you will or will not do. So again, Jesus just astonishes his hearers and he crosses this huge cultural and theological line by going way beyond the law of Moses. And he sets up this impossible standard of God's righteousness, which, let's face it, while we can talk about some of the implications of what he said, you can't really argue with him because deep down we know. We know harboring anger and bitterness is generally bad, whether we kill someone or not. Deep down, we know that lusting after people isn't good, whether we act on it or not. And deep down, we know that divorce ultimately falls short of God's design for marriage. It's evidence that something went wrong because ideally, it's supposed to be until death do you part. I can already hear the yes buts coming in. But the point that I'm making is that in this teaching, Jesus is establishing an impossible standard to people who think that they can achieve God's approval just by being good enough and just by maintaining or following the law. And Jesus is saying, ain't nobody that good. And really, that's not how you win God's approval anyway, just by maintaining the law to avoid being pulled over by the morality police. God loves us, and we win his approval by having the right heart, by humbly acknowledging our shortcomings and by receiving Christ and showing grace and love and by practicing forgiveness. Because then Jesus goes on to say that you've heard it said an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, which is basically a standard of justice. If you knock my tooth out, I get to knock yours out too. But Jesus says, do not resist an evil person. And if someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. He says, you've heard it said, to love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you to love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. That's crazy. But Jesus said that. And honestly, it just goes to show how perfectly Jesus would go on to fulfill the law completely because he practiced what he preached. He did all these things from the heart. he didn't retaliate when he was attacked. And when they struck him on one side, he turned the other cheek. Throughout his whole ministry, he loved his enemies, and he prayed for those who hurt him. Even when they nailed him to the cross, he prayed, "Father, forgive them because they don't know what they're doing." So Jesus fulfilled God's impossible standard of righteousness in a way that nobody else ever could. He made it personal. He went beyond the law to illustrate that sin is really a heart issue, not just a physical one. And the first way to address a heart issue is to admit that you have a problem. And with the standard Jesus set up here, he's saying everybody has a problem. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed today's devotion. And if you have any questions about anything I've said here today, please let me know. I'm here for you. I'm Travis Taylor, and that's Just Jesus.